below zero, everything's covered in white. Happy holidays, we won't make it out tonight. The heater broke an hour ago, but my wish still came true. I'm happy to be freezing cold with you. Ooh, ooh. Perfect holiday is one with you. Ooh, ooh.
All right, well, today we're kicking off a brand new series called Christmas Pictures. Christmas pictures. Anybody like receiving Christmas pictures in the mail? Yeah, anybody? You know, like maybe put them on your fridge. We used to have a clothesline in our house. We'd put everybody's little Christmas pictures. So when I was growing up, Christmas pictures, I didn't like them. I didn't really like the process. I liked getting them, but I didn't like them. They were nice. You get to see everyone's family, you know, with a little greeting on the bottom, a little Christmas phrase, like Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays or Peace on Earth, you know, joy to the world, deck the halls, whatever. And then we'd hang them up. But the process of actually being part of one, I didn't like. My parents were pretty into it. And so growing up, up until about 10th grade, we did them. We did the Christmas pictures, and we'd have to get dressed up. And I didn't like getting dressed up. I still don't like getting dressed up, in case you haven't picked up on that by now. And so, you know, we'd wear whatever my mom said we had to wear. Sometimes my brother and I, we'd match, which is absolute necessity in Christmas pictures, you know. So there's one year we had a little sweater on with a bear playing football, and that was the matching sweater. You know, we're like, whatever, different versions of one another. And so, yeah, it just wasn't my favorite. Then we go to like Sears or one of those stores, and we'd take a picture in front of another picture, you know, like a picture of a fireplace, and make it look like our home. And then we'd send it out, and then everyone would know this is what we look like now. I wasn't a huge fan of it, but naturally, when my kids got to a certain age, after I had kids, it was like, okay, let's do Christmas pictures. Now, if you haven't gotten a Christmas picture from us, it's because we haven't done them in years. But we actually did a Christmas picture back in 2017, all right? And this is what it looks like. You'll have to excuse my hair. This is me. My friends call this like the Italian artist stage of my hair because it was tight and slicked back. And that's my daughter, Mia, my wife, Allie, and my son, Logan. And everything looks just right, you know? I'm like casually looking at the family, like unaware, there's a picture being taken. And my daughter's smiling, my wife's smiling. My son, he's not smiling, but he's just disturbed enough that it's still cute, right? Everything's perfect. Well, here's what I could tell you about this Christmas picture, and probably a lot of other Christmas pictures, right? Sometimes there's a story that the picture doesn't tell, right? There's something that led up to that Christmas picture, and sometimes it's not accurately represented in the story. Sometimes the picture didn't feel as good as it ended up looking. So I could tell you, in this story, there was a little process. You know, first my wife was like, okay, we're gonna do Christmas pictures. And I wasn't thrilled, still not thrilled about being in Christmas pictures, but we did it. My kids weren't super excited about Christmas pictures, but we went to my parents' house because they had a really nice Christmas scene, right? So we went over there. It was time to take pictures. When we started, we were like, all right, let's do this on the floor. So we sat on the floor. Nobody was really getting it. I didn't know where to put my legs because I'm not especially flexible. And so it wasn't really working out. But we went for it a little bit until my daughter started to kind of unravel with my son. Eventually, I started getting to the point where I was like, enough of this. And so I was ready to move on. Then my daughter was like, forget this. I'm out of here. Somehow in this next one, I'm not in the picture, and it's just Allie and the kids, which probably led to this next picture. So then while she was standing, we were like, well, let's try to do this standing up. And so we kind of got back together, and that still wasn't really going all that well for us. And eventually we all felt the way my daughter looks in this last picture here, like this isn't happening. But we finished with this. Now, here's what I can tell you, okay? Don't tell anyone this. But this moment never actually happened. This was photoshopped. And we just took what worked from one and another one, put it together, and we sent it out to the world. It's like, this is what our life is like. Thank you. Let's pray. We're done. No, I mean, to be fair, I did send out the other pictures on the back of the Christmas card, just so you know, our life is not really like this. But this moment never actually happened. Sometimes there's a story that the picture doesn't tell. How about this Christmas picture? You ever seen this one or some version of this one? The traditional, what we call the nativity scene. You ever see that picture? You got the wise men, you got the shepherds, 2 shepherds, 1 sheep. Must have been a really rambunctious sheep, required 2 shepherds. But then we got Joseph and Mary. And of course, in the middle, we got baby Jesus in the manger with this nice star and the barn, stable, whatever it is, right? And that's this, you see this all over the place. And this is a really great thing. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying like this is a bad thing. But I would suggest that there is a story that this picture does not tell. I would suggest even that this moment never actually happened with all of these people in this scene exactly as it is. The whole idea of peace on earth and silent night and the tranquility of everything that happened on that magical evening really wasn't all that peaceful. It probably was not even close to silent. And if you look at that picture and you see everything neatly manicured and perfect, then you're not getting the story that that picture is supposed to represent. And I would suggest that the actual story behind that picture has so much more for us to take away than a neatly polished version of the nativity scene. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with this scene if we understand what is actually happening behind it. And so over the next couple weeks, we're going to look at some of the people in the story behind this picture. And I think what you'll find, whether you've heard this story a zillion times or have never heard it before, whether you believe all of the church stuff or you're not into the whole Christianity thing, I think you might be surprised to see just how much there is for us to walk away with from the craziness of this original Christmas story. And so one of the first and main characters in the story is Mary, right? Mary is known as the mother of Jesus. She was the mother of Jesus. She goes by the Virgin Mary. Maybe you've heard of her before, right? She's a pretty big deal. And her story is just radical. It's crazy. But it actually doesn't start with her. It starts with someone she's related to, a woman named Elizabeth. And so there's this lady, just to kind of set the scene here. There's this lady, her name's Elizabeth. She's wanted to have a child forever, and she's married to a guy named Zachariah who also wanted to have a child, not just because they wanted to be parents, but because at that time in that culture, having a child meant you had secured your place in the history of ancient Israel, which for them was everything. It was their nationality and their religion, and they wanted to be remembered in the line of ancient Israel. And so they couldn't have kids, but through some miracle, the two of them conceive, Elizabeth and Zachariah, and they end up having a baby that they name John. And their story is really a whole It's another story completely. But that John is not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's John the Baptist or John the Baptizer. And so at this point in the story, Elizabeth is pregnant, and she's been pregnant for a while, okay? And this is where Mary enters into the story. Here's how it goes. It says, in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, she's been pregnant for a while, God sent an angel named Gabriel to Nazareth, which is this no-name town, but it's a town that Mary's from, where Joseph is. It's a town in Galilee. And it says this angel was sent to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. And so we meet this girl, her name's Mary. The only thing we know about her is that she's a virgin, which is kind of a private detail to know about somebody, but that's what we find out about her, and she's got plans. She's pledged to be married. There's this guy, Joseph, who's expecting her to be his wife. She's expecting him to be her husband. They've got hopes, dreams, plans for a future, but those plans are interrupted by an angel named Gabriel. And so the angel shows up and says to her, "Greetings, you who are highly favored, the Lord is with you." This line here where he says, "Greetings, you who are highly favored," those are actually two of the similar words. It comes from the word meaning grace. This greeting here is literally like saying grace. You who have received lots of grace. Now, if you're not familiar with the word grace, we've talked about it here a little bit. It's this idea of God being in your corner, whether you did anything to deserve it or not. Like the angel is saying, Mary, this is good news. Like I come bringing good news. This is not bad news. You are highly favored. God's in your corner. This is a good thing. And he's preparing her for what he's about to say. He says, "The Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. Now, to you and I, we hear this story and we're like, oh yeah, okay, so there's a lady in the Bible who hears from an angel. That's a Bible thing that happens, and it's written in the Bible, right? People talking to angels, angels show up in the Bible. And so to you and I, it might seem like nothing, right? But to Mary, we know that before this whole thing with Elizabeth and Zechariah, it had been 400 years since anyone had heard from God. 400 years. It's a really long time. And so for Mary, there's issues there. It's not like, on Tuesday, Jane heard from God, and then Wednesday, Mary heard, and then Susan heard on Thursday. No one's having these miraculous encounters, and Mary has one, and she's troubled because this isn't something that happens every day. But the angel tells her, you're highly favored. I come in peace. This is good news, okay? And he says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. In case you missed it the first time where I said, greetings, you're highly favored, there's favor for you. You're good. You're good. God is in your corner. And what we find out later, side note, but important, Jesus shows us that God has this posture toward all of us. He is in our corner. All of us are recipients of this kind of level of grace. God is in your corner whether you did anything to deserve it or not. And so he says, don't be afraid you found favor with God. He says, you'll conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus, which is actually the Greek form of the name Joshua. Fun fact. He will be great, and we will be called the Son of the Most High. He says, the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end. Now, if you're not super familiar with all the names in the Bible, maybe that just seemed like a bunch of random references, but Mary knew exactly what this angel was saying. This angel is saying, your people have been waiting for a hero to come, and you're going to be his mom. So for Mary, this all makes sense, except for one detail. She says, well, how will this be since I'm a virgin? And the angel answers her and says, the Holy Spirit, God, it's God's Spirit that will come on you, that will come to you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. These are references to ancient writings she would have been very familiar with. He says, so the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. And then he comforts her and says, even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age. And she who was said to be unable to conceive is in her 6th month, for no word from God will ever fail. Mary replies, she says, I'm the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled. And then the angel leaves her. So the angel tells her, you're about to be the mom of someone everyone's been waiting for. This is radically good news. And it's going to happen in a totally miraculous way. And he says, and just so you know, there's someone else in your family that's in on this. In fact, Elizabeth, your relative, something special is happening with her as well. Mary wouldn't have known. They didn't live close to each other. It's not like Elizabeth, tweeted that she was having a baby. And so this angel tells her, and Mary then, we're told at that time, Mary got ready and she hurried to a town in the hill country of Judea. She had to take a journey where she entered Zachariah's home and greeted Elizabeth. So she runs. She hurries to go see Elizabeth, who's also had something special happen to her, okay? Now here's what you need to know. Maybe you know the story up to that point. It's like, oh, good, how exciting. She's going to celebrate with someone who's also experiencing something crazy. But for Mary, this would have been one of those moments where it's like super good news. And then reality hits. All of a sudden, she realizes what it means at that time and in that place to be pregnant but not be married. And to be pledged to be married, which was not just like being engaged. It was like as much of a commitment as someone who was already married. To end an engagement like that, you didn't just say, okay, we're not gonna do it. You had to go through a process to end a relationship where you had been pledged to marry someone. And so it was a big deal. And at that time, in that culture, the reality of life was that if you had been found to be pregnant in her situation, one, you can forget the guy that you wanted to be with, right? Probably Joseph's not gonna buy the whole I'm pregnant, but don't worry, it was an angel. And he doesn't. We're told that he doesn't buy that. And he decides he's going to end things, understandably. But he's a nice guy, so he does it in a quiet way. But for Mary, in that moment, what she's facing at that time, in that culture, she could have been brought out in front of everyone and stoned publicly, killed publicly. She could have been brought out in front of everyone and shamed, disowned by her family members, cut off from her father, cut off from the man she was pledged to be married to. No one's buying that this was something miraculous. It looks like a horrible scandal that maybe she's trying to make look like something miraculous. We don't know the details. But this was, it is hard to understand the level of hopelessness that Mary could have felt there. If you're cut off from your family, you've got no way to provide for yourself. She's looking at being a single mom, which is hard anywhere at any time. But in that culture, she would have been a single mom with no way to provide for herself. Her father would have cut her off. The man she was going to marry was not going to marry her, and no one else would have stepped in to do it instead of him. This would have been like a terribly uncomfortable feeling of uncertainty and fear. If you're married, this doesn't feel like being highly favored. And so she tells Joseph, and like I told you, he doesn't believe her, but being like a righteous man, we're told, being a good guy, he decides he's not going to shame her. He's just going to end things. But then he's told in a miraculous way, no, Mary is the real deal. This is really happening. And so he decides to get on board with this. Which meant not like, oh, it's all cool now. It just simply meant he was going to enter into the disgrace that she was currently living in. Because now he's saying, I'm cool with her, which looks like he's in on it. And at that time, that was not an okay thing. And so then, while all of this is happening, really inconveniently, the Roman Empire decides, all right, let's count how many people are in our territory, because they like to do that. They loved how big they were, and they love to count their people. So they order a census, which means Joseph has to travel back to his hometown of Bethlehem. And Mary, we know, goes with him. What we don't know is whether or not she actually had to go with him because they weren't married yet. She could have stayed back, likely, with her family, unless staying there in her hometown in the shame she was living in would have been too much to take alone. And so she goes with Joseph. Now, here's what you need to know about that journey to Bethlehem. It was 90 miles long. Some people say it may have taken as little as 4 days, or it could have taken as long as 12 days. But you think about it, especially if you've been pregnant. What would it take for you to be willing to travel 90 miles, maybe on foot, maybe on a donkey, maybe in a carriage, but probably not. Even if it is, it's still days traveling. Nights would have been extremely cold. Your days would have been extremely dangerous. People got robbed on the road in the ancient world all the time. And you're pregnant and can give birth at any time. And she decides to go with him. And so they travel all the way back to Bethlehem, 90 miles. And when she gets there, the time came for her, we're told, to give birth. The time came for the baby to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn son. Now, she gets to Bethlehem, right? And if you know the story, you know there was no room for her. The original language says there was no guest room. That could mean there was no room at an inn. It could mean there was no extra space in a home, but there's a few reasons for that. One, people were coming back to their hometowns, and so probably Bethlehem was really crowded at that point because other people were returning home for the census. But also, it's likely that people didn't want to welcome Joseph in with his pregnant girlfriend. Like at that time, there was a lot of shame associated with that because of how highly they held giving birth and being in the line of Israel. And so it was a big deal. And so there's no room. There's no room. And so she gives birth, and we're told she wrapped the baby in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. There was no room. Now this line here, she placed him in a manger, I think this is one of the most overlooked and underemphasized lines in the entire Christmas story. Luke's original readers would have understood the implications of laying a baby in a manger. We don't know exactly where they are. They could be in a stable. They could be in a cave. What we do know for sure is that they were in a place where animals were. And so Mary probably gave birth on the ground, probably in complete isolation, except for Joseph. It was probably Joseph who had to deliver the baby. And then she places the baby in a manger, something that looked like this. And even this picture has been dressed up to represent more of like a crib. But a manger was a feeding trough. It was something that animals ate out of. It was disgusting. There would have been spit and chewed up hay. And so she wraps this baby in cloth to protect the child from whatever is in there, and she puts him down. Why? Probably because she's just finished a 90-mile journey. The picture of the manger is a picture of sheer exhaustion, resignation, and isolation. When you have a newborn baby, you hold that baby. Unless you need to sleep, right? And then someone takes the baby and holds the baby for you. But the two of them, completely alone, with no place to put the child in the best place they had to put him. And they put him in a manger. If you've given birth, or if you've been part of that, or if you've had a child, like, what would it take? How far at the bottom would you need to be to take a child and put it in a feeding trough? And that's the picture here. It's a picture of isolation, pain, discomfort. The manger is the culmination of the mess that this story has been up to this point. And so if Mary's looking at this classic picture of a nativity here, you know how you look at a picture and you can feel how you felt when you were in it? You know, maybe it was at a wedding, you didn't want to be there, and you see yourself in that picture and you're like, yeah, I want to be there. Or maybe it was a really great day and you remember the feelings. When Mary pictured this, if you were to show Mary the manger, I'm sure it brought emotions, probably feelings that are very far from the feelings that you and I feel when we look at this and sing songs like Silent Night. They probably were never kneeling, posing nicely around the manger. They were probably laying down on the floor next to it at the end. And so I'm sure this is not what she pictured when she was told that she was highly favored, that God was in her corner. You know what I love about this story? If you're Mary, you don't want the manger in your story. You don't. It was not her shining moment. It was a moment that would have been painful, probably painful to remember. But what's interesting is that other people are invited to this scene to come see this baby. And you know what they're told? These shepherds that were invited? They're told by this angel who has a message from God, and the angel says to them, he says, this will be a sign to you. You'll find the baby wrapped in cloths, and it'll be lying in a manger. To which they would have replied, wait, what? What do you mean in a manger? I thought we were talking about the son of David. Like the king. Shouldn't he be in a palace on a throne, surrounded by paparazzi? No, but the angel says he'll be in a manger. He'll be the only baby, I guarantee it, in a manger, and that will be the one. And what is so comforting to me about this, and I imagine what was comforting to Mary when she heard that they knew it was Jesus because he was in a manger, was that God knew there would be a manger in the story. Even though Mary may not have wanted there to be a manger in the story, even though the manger was a picture of like everything she went through that she didn't want to go through. It was the culmination of the mess that she was in. God knew that there would be a manger in the story. And my guess is that probably right now to some extent or another. Maybe it's not right now, maybe it was a few weeks ago, or maybe it'll be in a few weeks. My guess is that there will be a manger in your story. Like, there will be something in your life that you don't want to be there. Maybe it's a broken relationship. Maybe it's a diagnosis. Maybe it's an empty chair at your Thanksgiving dinner, which is gonna be now an empty chair at your Christmas dinner. Maybe it's a fight with someone you don't wanna fight with. Maybe it's the loss of a job. Maybe it's a hard financial situation. Maybe it's something like looking back you don't want in your Christmas picture, and you definitely don't want to be part of your story. And what Mary's story tells us is that God knew about the manger in the story. And if you're like Mary and you're sitting there looking at the animals and the manger and the brokenness of everything that is in that moment, and you're wondering, like, where is God? For Mary, he was in the manger, literally in the manger. For her, the manger was showing her something about him, about who he was, about what his life was going to be like, about how this manger eventually grew up and became a cross that no one expected him to be on either. But it was in the manger that she began to learn something about him that she needed to know. And maybe there's a manger in your story. And maybe you've got like the good things in life, and maybe you've got all the things you celebrate and the things that make you happy and the things you like to keep clean and orderly, and maybe church is in this category. And then you've got the things you don't like to talk about, you don't like to think about because they're painful and they bring up all sorts of uncomfortable emotions, and they're not something you want to be part of your story. And maybe you can look at Mary's story and know maybe God is trying to show you something in the manger in the story. Maybe there's something you need to understand about him in the difficulty, in the hardship, in the unexpected, in the uncertainty, in the fear, in the things you would have never included if you were the one writing the story. And so when we look at that picture, the picture of the Christmas story, again, there's nothing wrong with that picture. But I hope you see this manger and you see the mess that it represents for Mary, and find hope in it. Understand that maybe in the mangers in your story, there's a God who's trying to show you something about who he is. Maybe the manger needs to be there in order for you to see that. Is there a manger in your story? And what is there to learn from it? What does God want to show you about himself from it? Maybe he's not in the difficult, in the easy things as much as he is in the mangers. I'm going to ask the band to come back up here. We're out of time, but here's what this looked like for me. Actually, at Christmas time, just a couple years ago, in December of 2019, we were getting ready to start this church, and it was exciting. There was all this anticipation. We had been planning and training and hoping and praying and talking literally for about 10 years about starting a brand new church. And it came time, the final weeks leading up to our launch day, which was set to be January 5th, 2020. And about 2 weeks before we opened up, through a series of events, we found out that the place where we were going to launch, we're planning on launching, was not actually the place that we were going to launch. We lost that place in a moment. And so there was a truck driver coming to deliver all of our stuff, and I literally had to call him and say, you have to go to a different address. And I sent him here. And thankfully, we were told we can launch here in this property in the basement. But at the time, the basement wasn't ready to hold a brand new church, at least in the state that it was in. And the next 2 weeks, literally around the clock, there were people spending hours, as many as they could. Sometimes it was as little as 30 minutes. Someone would come in and screw in a light. Sometimes people would come in, they'd spend the entire day painting a wall. But for hours and hours around the clock, from about 6:30 in the morning until about 10 o'clock at night, there were people here for 2 weeks trying to get this building ready. And I remember during that time thinking, this is not the way that it's supposed to be. Like, I'm supposed to be training this team and talking about the things that we value and explaining what our strategy's gonna be. And we had all these hopes for what we were gonna do throughout the Christmas season, and instead we were painting walls and fixing holes. I remember just days before we launched, Tom took a hammer, smacked the ceiling downstairs, and water just came pouring out. And at times it was hard. And this may seem silly, but for me, this was like a manger in this story. This was not the way that it was supposed to be. That Christmas Day, I literally spent the whole day on the couch asleep with black paint all through my hair because of what those weeks were like. But what I can tell you is that through those weeks, what happened was not something we could have planned on our own. Like, in that difficulty, a team formed. And I learned about like how when you bring people together and give them a mountain to climb, how at the end of it, how much closer people are when they get to the top. And what that began for us was a culture of like a team that helped to run a church. Then we had COVID, and that was a whole nother manger. But what happened there, what was a part of the story, honestly, I would have not asked for, ended up being something that shaped us and taught us something profound about what a church could be. And so, what's the manger in your story? What's the difficulty you're going through? And is it possible that there's a baby in the manger? That God is trying to show you something about him through this thing you would have never asked for?